Welcome to Last Stand Stories. In the dark corners of history, there are stories waiting, forgotten, covered up, or never told in this way. Today, we are inside one of them. The smell of gunpowder had not yet dissipated.
The scent of gunpowder in the Montana desert had engulfed everything, while the sun was burning people's bodies more intensely than ever that day. Not even a bird was flying near the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Everything was silent. The rifles had fallen silent. The horses had
This
fallen
George
silent.
Armstrong
The
Custer.
people had fallen silent. Only the wind was speaking, a low howling wind that sounded almost like a human voice. It was breathing long, slow breaths into the valley, scattering dust clouds, tossing broken pieces of feathers and making the grass sway with fragile vibrations. In this wind, if one were silent enough, if one listened carefully enough, one could hear the sound of the end of something, something great, something from which there was no return. On that hill, in the place called Greasy Grass, General George Armstrong Custer was lying. A few hours ago, under this same sun, in that same wind, this man had considered himself one of the greatest military geniuses in history. When his golden hair fluttered in the wind as he charged, the American public watched him like a legend. Newspapers wrote his name in capital letters. His photos were in albums. Women wanted his autograph. Men wanted to be like him. He had believed so deeply in his own charisma that, when the morning began, he was certain nothing could stop him. When his index finger pointed toward the west, the men beside him could feel this certainty. It could even suppress their fears regarding their own mortality. And now he was lying there. Around him, under the same sun, a deep silence reigned, stretching from the riverbanks to the slope of the hills. This silence was not empty. On the contrary, it was full, full like a conscience, full like an account. It carried the weight of something. This silence, coinciding with the final moment of one of the most famous commanders of Western civilization, was a kind of silence rarely seen in history, one that filled both the victors and the defeated, surrounding both at the same time. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were in the fatigue brought by victory, but this fatigue was something far beyond the ordinary. They had spent the longest and bloodiest day of their lives. The women and children gathered by the river were watching everything from a distance. The man lying on the hill, and the other lifeless bodies surrounding him. In Native American tradition, a battlefield was not a place of mourning, but a stage for a cosmic reckoning, a transition space where spirits had not yet departed, still wandering among the grass, still breathing. That was the belief that mattered. In Native American culture, touching an enemy's body or performing specific rituals on it did not mean humiliating that enemy. On the contrary, it often meant honoring them. Scalping in the traditions of many tribes meant acknowledging the enemy as a warrior. It meant accepting their courage. It meant telling their spirit that it was strong and that it should cross to the other world with this strength. This was a piece of a cosmology so nuanced to a Western eye, looking from the outside, so complex that it could never be fully translated. In Native American tradition, being a warrior was not just a physical act but a state of the spirit. But they would not grant Custer that honor, and the weight of that decision, at that hour, on that hill, was where the real story began. The women of the tribe, old and young, aunt and niece, mother and daughter, approached, carrying decades of memory. This memory was not merely personal. It was land memory, river memory, it was treaty memory, passed down from generation to generation and never erased. Custer's name stood in a specific place in this memory, and this place was not an honorable lie. It was a site of open, clear, and unforgivable betrayal. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie had been signed. The sacred Black Hills had been promised to the Sioux people forever. But 6 years later, in 1874, ironically enough, An expeditionary force under the direct command of Custer had entered these mountains and announced that gold had been found. The army had not withdrawn. The government had not protected the treaty, and the Sioux people had begun to be driven from their own sacred lands. And throughout this entire process, at negotiation tables and on forest roads, the voices of Native American leaders had not been heard, their warnings ignored. The women knew this. Their memory was oral, but what was oral was never forgotten. On the contrary, it was etched into the bones, into the earth, into the stories told by the fire throughout the winter. And now the man who took part in that story was lying on the hill. As the women approached, the wind seemed to have changed. It had turned into something lower, more inward, as if even the valley were holding its breath. The sun was still burning, but no longer with its harsh and cruel intensity, with a redder, more tired, more transparent light. The hour was approaching late afternoon. The waters of the Little Bighorn were flowing below, dense and silent. At that moment, one of the grandmothers of the tribe stood by the body, holding a long, thin object in her hand. The others formed a circle around them. No one was speaking, because this moment belonged not to words, but to intention. Custer was not a warrior in their eyes. Warriors kept their word. Warriors listened to the other side. Warriors acted not out of arrogance, but out of honor. This man, however, had listened only to himself throughout his life, living in the echo of his own fame, and that was why, on that hill, in that wind, those women were going to give him something different. Not honor. A message. The smell of gunpowder had now merged with the wind. Dust and smoke had fused with the invisible veil hanging over the valley. It was a heavy and tired veil, carrying the traces of everything that had happened under the same sky since the first light of the morning. Along the edges of the Little Bighorn, among the reeds on the riverbank, over the dry grass scattered on the hillside, there was the rain of what remained after the war. Not the war itself. War was like an avalanche. It arrives suddenly, sweeps everything away, then retreats. But the landscape it leaves behind speaks much longer than the avalanche itself. It speaks much more quietly and much deeper. George Armstrong Custer had spent the greater part of his life on a stage. This stage was sometimes the Virginia plains, sometimes the Kansas prairie, and sometimes the grand meeting halls of Washington. But wherever the stage was, the man on it was always the same, with his golden hair, the red necktie hanging from his neck, his double-breasted jacket sewn with care, his boots reaching to his knees, and that unchanging posture, as if he were posing for a photograph at any moment. This man was in love with his own image, and this love was mutual. America was also in love with him. From the middle of the century, the American press was in need of a new type of hero. The Civil War had ended, the country was wounded, and a new unifying figure was being sought to cover the deep cracks that had opened between the North and the South. Custer fell right into the middle of this need. He was blond, attractive, brave, and media-friendly. Every move he made became news. Every victory a legend. Every speech a manifesto. Newspapers carried his pictures on the headlines. His portraits entered homes. Children dreamed of being like him. Novels made space for him. It even reached a point where Custer was no longer just a general, but a symbol of a civilization advancing toward the West, the standard bearer of civilization erected over a wild and unsubdued landscape. But flags fall when the wind dies down. And that day at the Little Bighorn, the wind did not die down. On the contrary, that wind took everything back. As the sun began to tilt to the west, as the shadows began to stretch, the view on the hill had turned into a truth so naked that no novelist's imagination could have produced it. That meticulously sewn jacket, that necktie, those boots, that golden hair, they were all still there, yes, but what made them meaningful was gone. It was an emptied symbol. like a stuffed animal, its form preserved but its essence gone. Arrogance itself was perhaps a kind of stuffed animal. It looks grand from the outside, but if you examine its inside, you find nothingness. The Native American women were people who understood this. In their worldview, arrogance was not just a moral flaw, it was a cosmic imbalance. The functioning of the universe was built upon mutual relationships. Human had to live in harmony with nature, human with human, spirit with body, word with action. Everything that disrupted this harmony would sooner or later face a reckoning. Not only in this world, but in the next. Spirits would set out on their journeys with what they had taken. Virtue would be carried on this journey, as would arrogance. Custer's arrogance did not belong solely to him. Behind this arrogance lay the collective appetite of tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of politicians, thousands of journalists, and millions of ordinary American citizens. The desire to expand to the West, the ambition for territorial growth, the urge to civilize or eliminate everything it defined as wild. All of these had materialized in Custer's body. Beyond an individual, he was the carrier of the spirit of an era, and that is why his fall was something far beyond an individual defeat. It was the fall of an era, a mentality, a form of arrogance. But nature did not care about any of these. The waters of the Little Bighorn were flowing with the same speed, with the same sound. The river had not changed before or after the battle. It continued to erode its banks, rolling stones carrying fish. An eagle was soaring over the hills, drawing wide and tired circles. The grass was swaying. Insects were chirping. The sky was the same sky. Faced with this indifference of nature, a person feels one of two things, either a deep consolation or an overwhelming nothingness. What Custer had felt throughout his whole life was neither of these. He thought nature cared about him. He thought history flowed for him. He thought this battle was a stage prepared to reinforce his own glory. Yet history flows for no one. And this truth now, on that hill, amidst the dust clouds brought by the wind, was clearer than it had ever been. There were no ranks anymore, only a body. There was no fame, only silence. There were no tales of heroism, only a departed spirit, and the shells of mortality left behind. The women had not done this stripping. Time had done it. Death had done it. Reality had done it. The women had only come to face this nakedness with what they carried in their hands, with the memory they carried in their minds, with the reckoning they carried in their hearts. The wind on the hill changed again. It was no longer just sound, it was like an intention, like a direction. Someone watching from afar would think the wind was pulling the women toward there, or conversely that the women were pulling the wind toward there. The difference between the two perhaps did not matter for that moment. What mattered was what was about to begin on that hill. The reckoning of a great arrogance in the quietest and most permanent way, without words, without stumbling, without apologies. Just an intention, two hands, and a very old wisdom. The women were walking. This walk was not with haste or anger. On the contrary, it was a heavy, measured walk that had filtered through long years and long winters, every step taken with awareness. The older ones were in front. This was not a coincidence. The tribe's memory lived most in them. The deepest roots were in the oldest trees. The faint, almost whispering sound that came out as their feet crushed the dry grass was so in harmony with the silence of the valley that one would think these sounds had always been there, perhaps waiting for this moment. The sun had begun to tilt behind the hills. The light had changed. It was no longer that harsh, vertical, relentless noon light. It was a horizontal and tired light spreading equally over everything, lengthening the shadows, darkening the colors. The yellow grass had turned to gold in this light. The red soil of the hills had turned copper. And on that hill, on that copper-colored earth, Custer was lying. The silence around him was now different from the morning, denser, heavier, as if something had accumulated in the air throughout the hours. The objects in the women's hands were small. Someone looking from the outside, perhaps, would not notice them at first glance. But when these objects were carried on this land, in the hands of these people, they gained a weight that no large weapon could carry. They were needles carved from bone, thin, long, and sharp. For generations, the women of every tribe had used these needles for different purposes: to sew leather, to bead, to repair tents. They were tools that lived in the memory of the hands, things the fingers knew, not the mind. But the needles carried this day were being carried for a purpose outside the ordinary. And to understand this purpose, one first had to understand this. In Native American cosmology, the physical function of an object was only one side of its spiritual function. A needle that sewed leather was also a tool that connected two things: the visible to the invisible, the material to the spirit, this world to the other. A needle was a tool of transition, and this transition did not always have to be through sewing. Sometimes it was also used to carry a message encoded in physical form, sent from this world to the other. The women knew this. The mothers of the older ones also knew this, and their mothers. This knowledge was written in no book because information written in books was dead, frozen, could not change. But information passed on through words, examples, observation, and application, deepened a little more with each generation, took root a little more. Beliefs regarding ears stood in a common place in the traditions of many tribes. The ear was not just an organ that receives sound. The ear was the door of the spirit opening to the world. A person was fed by what they heard, grew by what they heard, was shaped by what they heard, and that is why what a person heard throughout their life, what they chose to hear, or looking deeper, what they chose to avoid hearing, determined the shape that person's spirit took. Closing the ear was closing the door to the world. Closing the ear was denying the reality of someone else. Closing the ear was arrogance. Custer's ears had remained closed for many years. This was not just a metaphorical phrase. In its true sense, concretely, in the way it had passed into historical records, it had remained closed. The Sioux leaders sitting at the treaty table in 1868 had spoken. Those ears had not listened. The officers who received warnings before the expedition set out had said. Those ears had not heard. His own commanders had said he was underestimating the numbers, that he could fall into a trap. Those ears had rejected it. Arikara scouts had hinted that he should think once more before advancing. Those ears had ignored it. Everything hearable had not been heard. And now, in that copper-colored light, in that heavy silence, the women had come and stood before this long deafness. One of the older ones leaned over. Her movement was slow, determined, and did not have the slightest struggle, not the slightest haste. This was not the movement of anger. Anger was temporary, shallow. It emptied a person's inside. This movement was the movement of something much older and much colder, like a river changing its bed, like water seeping through a mountain. Invisible, but unstoppable. The bone needle caught the light for a moment. The bone, with its whiteness, looked bright on that copper soil. It was carved from the bone of an animal, perhaps a bison, perhaps a deer. The animal was no longer there, but its bone had survived. The bone was the most permanent thing left behind after death, a reality where the bone remained where the flesh had passed, with an object carrying this reality in her hand. At that moment on that hill, something great was being prepared. The other women gathered around her. The circle tightened. The sound of the river was coming from down the valley. Still the same, still unstoppable, still timeless. A few birds passed through the sky, quickly and without paying attention to anything. The wind, that low howling wind that sounded like a human voice, stopped for a moment. Silence, that real and absolute silence, filled the valley, and within that silence, the tribe's memory, with the accumulated weight of decades, through that thin object carved from bone, began to walk on an invisible bridge, stretching from this world to the other. The women were not speaking, because this was the kind of moment that did not need words. Words were for those who wanted to agree. To agree was for those who wanted to listen, and to listen was for those whose ears were open. This man had never listened in his life, but he would not go to the other world deaf. The wind had stopped. This was not an ordinary stillness. In the Montana plains, the wind rarely stops. It usually changes direction, slows down, sometimes drops, but does not completely fall silent. At that moment it stopped, as if all the air, all the breath, all the movement filling the valley had pulled itself back to concentrate on that single point. Even the eagle over the hills had stopped soaring. It remained motionless for a moment, as if it too were aware of something, as if it too were waiting. The women's circle had closed. Someone looking from the outside could no longer see the inside. This was intentional. Some moments belonged only to those who belonged to that moment. The list of witnesses was kept small, because testimony kept small took deeper root. Ceremonies performed in front of large crowds carried a show, but rituals performed only in front of a few, only in front of those who knew, reached deep into the spirit. This was of the second type. The old woman was still leaned over. Her hands were not shaking. Her breathing was not irregular. Throughout the years, how many things had these hands sewn? How many things had they repaired? How many wounds had they bandaged throughout how many winters? The wisdom of these hands was far beyond the mind. It was a wisdom that lived in the fingers, that existed in touch, that emerged only by doing. And now these hands were preparing for a different kind of repair. The bone needle flashed once more in the light. That light had now become even redder. The sun had almost buried itself behind the hills. The last rays were coming in horizontal cuts, painting everything with the color of embers. In this light, the redness of the soil had deepened. The yellowness of the grass had darkened. The lines on the women's faces had become distinct. These hours of the day were transition hours in Native American tradition. That thin slice suspended between two worlds, when the day has ended and the night has not yet begun. Everything done in these hours stood at an equal distance to both sides. Was this an intentional timing? Perhaps yes. Perhaps no. Perhaps great truths chose the timing themselves. Before coming to the essence of the ritual, one had to understand its philosophy. Because this was not an act of revenge. Revenge was a personal reckoning, giving back the pain given to someone to another. But what happened here was far outside of that. This was an act of cosmic balancing. It was like the universe's own operation, its own internal logic, making a correction. It was like adding weight to keep a scale in balance. In the Sioux and Cheyenne tradition, the most important thing the spirit carried to the other world was the habits it acquired in this world. How you lived, that is how you crossed over. What you listened to, that is what you carried. What you ignored, that followed you. Every door you opened in this world remained open in the next, and every door you closed, Custer's ears had closed in this world. And if this closing was carried to the other world, if that spirit wandered beyond with the same deafness, then what could it learn? What could it understand? What could it change? The journey of the spirit was a journey of learning. A spirit that could not listen would make this journey incomplete. It could not come to places it could not reach. It could not see things it could not see. The women were not giving him a punishment. They were giving him a lesson. This distinction was everything. The old woman held the bone needle in her left hand. Her right hand moved over the body like a healer, like a sage without haste, but without remaining indecisive. One had to find the right place for that moment, and the right place was not a physical matter, but a spiritual one. The ear was the place where the world flowed into the spirit. The ear was the boundary where hearing began and ended. And at this boundary, at this thin, fragile, extremely sensitive point, a message would be left. The tribe's teaching was clear on this matter. If a person refused to hear in this world, a reminder could be left on their body, on that special point of their body, so they could hear in the other world. This reminder was not just a physical mark, it was a spiritual seal. It was a sign left attached to the spirit's travel bag so that it would not forget, so that it would not continue to remain deaf, because the spirit would continue its physical habits in some way, even without the body, and breaking these habits sometimes required a reminder. The ear you did not give while alive, you will give after death. This was the essence of that moment, this simple, this deep. The bone needle moved toward the left ear. The movement was slow, measured, and contained not the slightest anger. If anger had entered that movement, the ritual would have been broken. Anger made things personal. A ritual that becomes personal ceases to be universal. And this act had to be universal, not as something done to a man, but as a response left to an era, a form of mentality, a concept of arrogance. When the needle touched, the wind began again. It was possible to say this was a coincidence, but in that valley, at that hour, in that moment, the word coincidence somehow felt insufficient. The wind passed through the valley, low and deep. The sound of the river came up high for a moment. The eagle above began drawing its circles again, and the old woman, after the left ear was completed, moved to the right without pausing at all, because the message would be sent not to one ear, but to both. One ear could be a coincidence. 2 ears would be an intention. 2 ears would be a wholeness. 2 ears would be an inscription carved onto both pillars of that invisible bridge stretching from this world to the other. You did not hear us while you were alive. You did not hear our warnings. You did not hear our treaties. You did not hear the sound of our lands. You did not hear the sound of our ancestors' spirits. You did not hear the sound of our children. You did not hear the sound of our rivers, our mountains, our plains. You did not hear the sound of your own officers. You did not hear the sound of your own scouts, but you will hear in the other world. Thanks to this seal, thanks to this thin sign carved from bone, your spirit will not carry this deafness, because deafness belonged to this world. It belonged to arrogance, to the ambition for fame, to that blindness born from looking down on others. And now that this world is left behind, that deafness will also be left behind. You will cross to the other world with your ears open, whether you want to or not. When the right ear was completed, the women were still silent. There was no reason to speak. Everything that needed to be said had been said, but without using words. This was a communication beyond language, the language of symbols, rituals, and intentions. All the academies, all the libraries, all the dictionaries of the Western world could not fully translate this moment. Some things were understood only by doing. The old woman stood up straight. Her hands dropped to her sides. The bone needle stayed in her palm. The last redness of the sun, now completely buried behind the hills, remained as a thin strip in the sky. The night was descending into the valley silently, step by step, shadow by shadow. The women dispersed. Their walks were as measured as when they had arrived. There was no haste, nor was there any regret. They did not look back, because there was nothing left to look at. What needed to be done had been done. What needed to be left had been left. On the hill, on that hill now sinking into complete darkness, the wind lowered again, and the valley, deep and tired, began to sleep. Days passed. Under the endless sky of Montana, the little Bighorn Valley was left alone with its own silence. The river continued to flow. The grass continued to sway. The eagles continued to draw their circles. Nature had a skill that humanity would never fully understand in terms of absorbing even the greatest upheaval experienced upon it. It would take everything, digest it, cover it with time. The memory of the earth was different from human memory. It was more patient, deeper, and required fewer words. But in the world of humans, words had already been set in motion. When the support units under the command of General Alfred Terry reached the valley on the morning of June 27, 1876, the scene they encountered froze them. Military training prepares a person for many things, for danger, turmoil, chaos, death. But there are some scenes that no training can prepare for. This was that kind of scene. The image spreading along the hills was recorded, passed into reports, and conveyed to the superiors. But the language of the reports was the language of an army, a language that forced one to be sterile, technical, and emotionless. This language was not always sufficient to carry the truth. Even among Terry's officers, who tried to maintain the composure of their duty, some struggled that day. Custer's body was identified. The other bodies beside him were identified. Counts were made. Records were kept. And among those records, there was something that careful eyes noticed, but could not quite understand what it meant at that first moment. The ears, both ears, the trace of something. Army surgeons took notes, but these notes would embark on a strange journey in the following years, sometimes emerging into the light, sometimes buried in drawers, sometimes covered up. Because in Washington, in the marble corridors of the East, there were people who feared the echo these notes could create. The image of the hero was fragile. America needed Custer, or rather, it needed what Custer represented. 1876 was a sensitive year for America. It was the 100th anniversary of the country's founding. A great celebration was being prepared in Philadelphia. The enthusiasm of the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence had surrounded the entire country. And right in this festive atmosphere, the golden-haired general, the symbol of the conquest of the West, had been defeated by the native people. This was already enough to shake the administration. If news of a ritual were to come out on top of that, the image of the hero would not just crack, it would shatter into pieces. The American public would learn that the golden-haired legend it had nurtured in newspaper headlines for half a century had been made the subject of a spiritual message by native women. This was no longer just the story of a general. This was a blow struck at the foundations of a civilization claim, a narrative of superiority, and a mythology of expansion. The decision to cover it up, in all likelihood, was not made in a single room, in a single night. Such decisions are never made that way. They are made slowly. An officer removes something from his report. Another does not add it on. A third leaves the asked question unanswered. A fourth changes the subject. And thus, without anyone's complicity, but with everyone's silent approval, a truth becomes invisible. The greatest cover-up operations in history are built not at conspiracy tables, but in the margins of official correspondence. The American press immediately turned Custer into a legend. When the news of the defeat reached the country, the first reaction was shock and anger. But this anger soon turned into something else. It was a transition from the language of mourning to the language of epic. Newspapers wrote "The Last Battle." Painters made "The Last Stand." Poets poured out poems. Novelists wrote novels. Custer became a hero even with his defeat. He transformed into a figure who fought to his last soldier, who challenged his enemy alone, and who didn't bow even in front of death. This transformation was carefully managed. Which details were highlighted? Which ones were covered up? These preferences were not accidental. The hero's image, just like a well-prepared painting, depended on what remained within the frame and what was left outside, and the information about the ritual was the thing left outside the frame, but the truth never completely disappears. Elizabeth Custer, the general's widow, struggled for decades to keep her husband's legend alive. She wrote books, gave speeches, penned memoirs. She described her husband as a saint, as a martyr, as a hero. But in some interviews, in some private correspondence, question marks were appearing. That ear issue, that ritual, those women. Elizabeth never fully accepted these in front of the public, but she never denied them either. She stayed silent. Silence is also a kind of response. Decades passed. By the beginning of the 20th century, some historians began to dive into the depths of the archives. Original copies of army reports, notes of surgeons, oral testimonies of chiefs, tribal accounts. These began to surface one by one, and every new document opened another corner of that covered-up truth. A narrative conveyed by a Cheyenne woman in later years caught the attention of many historians. In this account, the reason why the ritual was performed was expressed in very clear language. Custer had burned Cheyenne villages during the Hancock expedition in 1867. In 1868, on the banks of the Washita River, in the middle of winter, he had raided a sleeping Cheyenne village. He had created great destruction, including women, children, and the elderly. And before that raid, Cheyenne leader Black Kettle had come for a peace negotiation, had spoken face to face with Custer. Custer had not listened to this conversation. Black Kettle had lost his life in that raid, a man who wanted peace, who warned, who applied, who begged, and not to listen to this man, not to give ear to him, to ignore his voice. That was what remained alive in the minds of those women on that hill. The ear issue, therefore, was not just a ritual. As years and decades passed, the narratives of Native American communities began to enter the agenda of academics. Oral history was continuing to flow alongside written history, sometimes in front of it, sometimes through it, and in places where these two histories intersected, interesting truths surfaced. The person who first shared the Custer ear issue with the public was a Cheyenne woman. Her name passed in some sources in different forms, but what she told was consistent. Years after the battle, in a storytelling session, she had conveyed this in an old and calm voice. What she told did not contain anger. It did not contain regret. What it contained was a deep and still certainty, a sense of inner peace that was closed to debate regarding that what had to be done had been done. Those who heard this account, those who recorded it, could not figure out what to do for a long time, because this information was hanging between two worlds. On one side, there was official American history, a narrative shaped to protect its hero, every corner of which was carefully arranged. On the other side, there was the tribe's own narrative, not written but indelible, not official but deep and consistent. And the distance between these two narratives was not just a matter concerning reality. It was a matter concerning what one wanted to be heard. This was a complete reflection of what Custer had done throughout his life. Some voices were heard, some were not. A selective hearing, a selective history, a memory mechanism that accepted what it wanted to be accepted and rejected what it wanted to be rejected. It was exactly at this point that the message of those bone needles gained a different depth, because the ritual had addressed not just a man, but a system. It had addressed not just a general, but that entire invisible structure that created, fed, protected, and turned that general into a legend after his death. And this structure, just like Custer, had continued not to hear what it did not want to hear. But waters, in the end, always rise. In the second half of the 20th century, as the Native American rights movement gained strength in America, historiography also began to shake. The Little Bighorn was reevaluated. Custer was reevaluated. Stories that had been told one-sidedly until that day began to be listened to from different mouths. And among those different mouths, that ritual was also told. When a monument was erected on the battlefield in 1983, discussions flared up again. Initially, the monument commemorated only the fallen American soldiers. Native American communities objected to this one-sidedness. After years of struggle in 1991, a decision was made to make a new arrangement to commemorate Native American warriors in the same field. This small but important change was a step backward for a historiographical understanding, a silent but meaningful step, and within that step lived the message of those bone needles, because the message had been sent not only for one spirit, but also for a history that refused to listen, would sooner or later have to hear things it should not have heard. Every truth covered up would one day leak from a crack, and the light entering from that crack, no matter how thin, would completely transform the darkness. The little bighorn is still there today. The river continues to flow. The hills are the same hills. The grass is the same grass. Montana's sky is still that great, that endless, that all-watching sky. But everyone who steps onto that land, whether they want to or not, feels a weight, the weight of collective memory, of covered-up voices, of unheard warnings. This weight is something like the seal left by those bone needles, not physical but real, invisible but felt, not temporary, because it has seeped into the earth, mixed into the air, and blended into the sound of the wind. And that wind in Montana still blows, that low and deep howling wind that sounds almost like a human voice, the wind that fills the valley, makes the grass sway, raises the dust but forgets nothing. To be able to listen, it is enough just to give ear.
Thank you for watching Let's Stand Stories. History is not written only in books. Sometimes it is hidden in the sound of a wind, sometimes in a forgotten hill, sometimes in a warning never heard. See you in the next story.